When I was a child, around 8 years old, my parents and I used to spend the summers at my grandmother's cabin, an old wooden house in a rural area, far from any phone signal or nearby neighbors. The cabin was beautiful during the day, surrounded by trees and with a tranquility that felt like a dream. But at night, everything transformed. The shadows stretched, and every creak of the wood seemed to whisper ancient secrets. The cabin had a room at the end of a narrow hallway, a room my grandmother called the Room of Old Things. It was filled with furniture covered in sheets, boxes full of old things, and objects that seemed out of place, as if they had belonged to another time. My grandmother always told me not to go in there, to leave things as they were. I never paid it much attention until that night. It was late, and a heavy storm broke out outside. I remember waking up in the guest room bed. The flash of lightning filtered through the window, illuminating the room in white and blue bursts. That's when I felt that strange sensation, as if someone was watching me. I opened my eyes, and what I saw froze my heart. In the farthest corner of the room, standing in complete silence, was a woman. Her figure was barely visible in the dim light, but I noticed her pale skin and her long, worn-out dress, as if it had been soaked and worn down by the years. Her dark hair fell messily over her face, and though I couldn't see her eyes clearly, I knew they were fixed on me, watching me. I tried to scream, but I couldn't. My lips seemed glued together, and my lungs wouldn't respond. Terrified, I yanked the sheets and covered my head, shaking and praying it was just a dream. I don't know how long I stayed like that, but eventually, sleep overtook me. The next morning, I told my grandmother what I had seen. I expected her to tell me it was just my imagination, or offer me some kind of comfort. But instead, she looked at me with a seriousness I had never seen before. "If you see her again, don't look at her. Don't talk to her. Walk away. Close your eyes and think of something else," she said, squeezing my shoulder with a cold, trembling hand. The warning only made me more scared. That night, when I went to sleep, I tried to think of something else, but the storm started again, and the discomfort returned. I didn't want to look. I didn't want to know, but something made me open my eyes, and there she was again, in the corner of the room, this time closer. Her face was partially visible. Her skin was pale, almost grayish, and her lips formed a sinister line, as if hiding a broken smile. I forced myself to remember my grandmother's words and tightly shut my eyes, praying she would disappear. But then I felt something on the bed, a cold weight, as if someone was leaning toward me. A whisper brushed my ear, soft, like the edge of a knife. "You've already seen me." A chill ran through me, down to my soul. This time, fear overtook me, and I screamed at the top of my lungs. My parents and grandmother rushed to the room, but when they turned on the light, the woman was gone. The corner was empty. After that, my parents decided it was best not to return to that cabin. But they never told me why, and even though I grew up, the memory of the woman in the corner never faded. Years later, when my grandmother passed away, I found an old black and white photo among her things. In it, there was a young woman wearing a long dress with her hair loose. I recognized her instantly. It was her, the woman from the corner. On the back of the photo, my grandmother had written something that chilled me to the bone. "Never let her see you." Since then, I sometimes feel her presence in the corner of my room. Even if I move, even if I close my eyes, I know she's there, just waiting for the moment I open my eyes again so we can meet once more. This is one of those memories that still haunts me. A couple of summers ago, a few friends and I decided to get away from the stress and spend a weekend in a cabin deep in the mountains. The place was ideal for disconnecting, with no electricity and surrounded by tall, dense trees. You could only reach it by a narrow dirt path, and the isolation was complete. Perfect for relaxing, or so we thought at first. The cabin had an old-fashioned charm. From the first day, I noticed a mirror hanging on the small living room wall. It was old, covered in dust, and had dark stains on the frame that seemed to have been there for years. We didn't think much of it, assuming it was just part of the rustic decor of the cabin. It was easy to ignore during the day. The first night passed without incident. We sat around a campfire, telling silly stories and laughing until exhaustion took over. However, the second night, something changed. It was around midnight when one of my friends, Marco, got up to go to the bathroom. The only way to get to the bathroom was to cross the living room where the mirror was. When Marco came back, he seemed strange, uncomfortable, but he didn't mention anything at the time. The next day, Marco confessed to us that, as he passed the mirror, he had noticed something very odd. He said he had seen a blurry figure reflected in it, but it wasn't his own reflection. At first, he thought it was just his distorted image, but he noticed that the figure didn't mimic his movements. Instead of following him, it remained still, staring at him with a vacant expression. We tried to calm him down, and he himself tried to convince himself it was just the darkness playing tricks on his mind. But when he told us, I could see the fear on his face. Still, we laughed it off, chalking it up to nerves and the shadows of the forest. That same night, past midnight, something even more unsettling happened. This time, it was Carla who got up to get some water. As she crossed the living room, she heard a faint murmuring. Thinking one of us was sleep-talking, she went closer to investigate. That's when she stopped in front of the mirror. She didn't tell us right away, but later when she finally confessed, her story was chilling. Carla told me that she felt an inexplicable cold when she approached the mirror. The room was dim, but she could still make out her own reflection, and something else. Beside her reflection, as though standing behind her, was another figure. This time, it was a woman with dark hair and pale skin, a look of sadness on her face. Carla froze, staring at her, until the figure smiled. But it wasn't a normal smile. The woman in the mirror grinned slowly, disturbingly. At that moment, Carla felt an intense panic and ran to wake us all up. She woke us up, speaking quickly with a face full of terror. She led us to the living room, and with a flashlight, we illuminated the mirror. By then, the reflection was empty, and although we tried to reassure her, we couldn't ignore the fear in her eyes. Still, we tried to convince ourselves it was just exhaustion, and that Carla had experienced some kind of hallucination. We had barely returned to our rooms when we heard another noise. This time, it was footsteps in the living room, like someone was walking slowly through it. I looked at my friends. We were all scared. We went back to the living room, convinced someone was there. But when we arrived, we found it empty. Except for one thing, the mirror now had several handprints in the dust. They were on the other side of the glass, as if someone from the other side had pressed their hands against it. We stared at each other in silence, trying to process what we were seeing. That was enough. Without thinking twice, we packed our things and left the cabin in a hurry. It took us an hour to reach the car, but we preferred to run in the dark than stay another minute in that place. When we got to the city, each of us went straight to our homes, and no one mentioned the incident again until days later. The most unsettling part came afterward. When I got home, I couldn't shake the image of those handprints from my mind. I decided to look into the cabin's history, and what I found sent a chill down my spine. Years ago, a woman had mysteriously disappeared in that area. Some said her face could still be seen in the mirrors of the cabin, as though she was trapped there, waiting for someone to release her, or to accompany her. Since then, I can't look at a mirror in a cabin without feeling a shiver. I don't know what we saw that night, but I never want to experience it again. Mirrors hold things we don't understand, and after that experience, I prefer not to find out what those things are. A few years ago, I decided to spend a weekend at a remote cabin with my partner. We wanted to disconnect from everything and be surrounded by nature. The cabin was deep in the woods, without electricity or cell service. It sounded perfect. No distractions, just peace. The first night was pretty quiet. The cabin creaked more than I expected, and the air was strangely cold. But I didn't give it much thought. I figured it was just the age of the place. But when the second night came, something changed. I woke up in the middle of the night for no apparent reason, with that strange feeling that someone was watching me. My partner was sleeping deeply beside me, and the place was completely silent. I tried to ignore it and go back to sleep, but right then, I heard a sound outside. Footsteps. Slowly, it seemed like someone was walking around the cabin. My heart started racing. I got up from the bed and, barely breathing, went to the window to see if anyone was outside. But there was absolutely no one there. Still, the footsteps continued, and suddenly they stopped right in front of the main door. I froze, not knowing what to do. And then, someone knocked on the door 3 times, slowly, almost calculated. The silence that followed was worse than the sound. My mind was torn between opening the door or not, and in the end, I decided to leave it be. But then the knocking started again, this time on the windows, as if someone was circling the cabin and tapping on each window as they passed. Scared, I woke up my partner, and we both listened in silence, paralyzed. Suddenly, we heard something even more disturbing. A voice, low and monotone, whispering from outside. "Come out! Please, come out!" The voice was cold and lifeless, but it was persistent. I didn't know what to do. We just looked at each other, trying to find some explanation. The knocks continued on different windows, and the voice kept saying, "Come out! Come out!" The noise suddenly stopped, and an absolute silence fell over the cabin. Several minutes passed until we dared to move, thinking that whoever it was had finally left. We decided to pack our bags and leave right then. But just as we reached the door, I noticed something scratched into the wood. "I'll be waiting." We got out of there without looking back, and never returned. I still don't have an explanation for what happened, but every time I remember that night, a chill runs down my spine. Whatever was out there wasn't just trying to scare us. It seemed like it was waiting for something.